And language, if you look in the book, it's a pretty long chapter. The lecture's not going to be that long, mainly because the chapter dealt with a lot of arguing about this is how they saw it once upon a time, and now we see it this way, and I didn't put that in the lecture. So if you want the philosophy as to how we interpret language in our brains, then I don't really all this stuff is theoretical. I'm not exactly sure why they write it the way that they do, or why they did in this book. Uh, Maybe it's a textbook. I don't know. Anyway, we're going to talk about language. Maybe. There we go. Human speech and language are arguably unique. No other animals regularly make sounds in the way that we do when we speak, and none of them use those sounds to express a communication system as rich and as structured as human language. There's a reason why I have this up here, and there's a reason why you're looking at this. This is from the movie Roxanne it's got Steve Martin in it, and Daryl Hannah, and this is Rick Rossovich. Anyway, at one point, Steve Martin's character tells Rick Rossovich, it's Cyrano de Bergerac. It's a remake of Cyrano de Bergerac-esque uh, plot. Anyway, at one point he tells him, "Tell her you're afraid." He says, "What? Tell her you're afraid." Of what? Worms. Words. You're afraid of words. And he mishears him, and instead of saying, "I was afraid of words," he says, "Worms, Roxanne, worms," which is just hilarious. Anyway, if I showed it to you, then they would copyright or they would tell me it was a copyright infringement. So if you want to watch that scene, it's only about 20 or 30 seconds long. Click on the worms in your on the lecture and on the PowerPoint, and you can see what I'm talking about. It's kind of funny. It's a good movie. It's one of my favorite movies. It's a love story, and I'm a sucker for love stories. So there you go. We rarely experience language use as difficult, perhaps because much of our use of language is supported by automatic unconscious cognitive processes. By the time we are skilled speakers of a language, we barely notice all the hard work that we are doing. The processes are so automatic that they occur even if we don't want them to. I find it impossible to write if people are talking nearby, as I can't stop listening to what they're saying. And that's not me, that's the author of the text. I thought that it made a lot of sense, so I left it in there. This fast reflex like processing of speech and language was a starting point of Fodor's interest in the modularity of human information processing, following a colleague's observation that syntax, or grammar, in language was so automatic. It was like a reflex, and that's what got Fodor to start researching it. Humans process linguistic information in a way that has certain distinct differences from their perceptual and cognitive processing of other kinds of information. And this has been argued to reflect a mode of linguistic processing which may be fundamentally distinct from other kinds of knowledge. Although language may interact with many of the other processes, such as working memory and attention, there are theoretical reasons to suspect that language may utilize a distinct and specialized set of perceptual and cognitive functions. Spoken language, human language, is generally considered to contain structure at a number of different levels. Sentences can be broken down in phrases, phrases into words, words into morphemes, morphemes into individual speech sounds. As we move through these levels, we are describing elements of language at progressively finer levels of detail. To start at the lowest level, we normally consider individual speech sounds to represent the smallest and finest level of structure in spoken language. This is the phonetic level. Phonemes are the building blocks of spoken language. Getting the right phonemes in the right order is often considered to give words their individual lexical identity. Thus, toad and dote contain the same phonemes in different orders, but they are not especially easily confusable, and they sound very different. And of course, there are two ways of learning languages. One is the whole word method, and the other is the phonetic method. In the phonetic method, you sound words out. So instead of saying phonemes, instead of looking at this and seeing phonemes, you would see phonemes. So you would break it into its several parts. If you've ever listened to me trying to pronounce some of the medical terms, especially the new medicines, I struggle with them, and I have to pronounce them phonetically. Now, normally, if I know a word, let me CCK, what is it? Wait a minute. Let me think of a medical term that I have no problem with. Cholecystokinin. Cholecystokinin is a enzyme that is produced by the gallbladder that your body uses to break down fat. Cholecystokinin. So if we were trying to figure out if you had gallbladder disease, we would measure your cholecystokinin level. The cholecystokinin, I can pronounce it without any problem, but if you just saw it, you might have to pronounce it phonetically. But because I know the word, it's easy for me to say it without stumbling over it. Other words, brand new words, and if you've ever taken Psych 255, you've listened to me struggle with select words because they don't seem to go together very well. Same way with Psych 360, which is drug use and abuse. Some of the medical chemical terms, chemical names for the different drugs, a little bit difficult. They're just a bunch of phonemes stuck together, and sometimes it's difficult to pronounce them and to figure out how you're supposed to pronounce them. A good example would be aspartame. Aspartame, aspartame, it looks like aspartame. And a lot of people probably pronounce it that way, but in reality it's pronounced aspartame instead of aspartame. Just as examples. The next levels of structure are lexical and morphological structure, which refers to words and substructures of words respectively. If words refer to distinct conceptual entities, then the morphemes can be considered to form the units within a word which alter the meanings and status of words. These can be thought of often as forming of often. As it's difficult for me to say of often because because those two words are very similar. Anyway, these can be thought of often as forming stems and affixes. For example, walk, walked, walking, walker. And of course, the joke is wedding suit. I distinctly said wedding suit, and of course, he's wearing a welding suit, and he misheard her and decided to bring a welder to a wedding. As funny as that is. Semantic representation refers to the meaning of words, and syntax refers to the grammatical rules that delineate how words can be combined to make sentences. There are also pragmatic aspects of language as well as specific uses of language, such as metaphor and the use of language in discourse. Spoken language has further distinctive properties such as speech rhythm and intonation, though we typically consider these different levels of language to form qualitatively distinct stages. There is considerable interaction between some of these levels. Now, at this point in the book, she started talking about sign language, which was a little bit different. I could have put that in, except the problem in this textbook is the textbook comes from England. So she wasn't using American Sign Language, she was using British Sign Language, which doesn't have anything to do, I mean, they're very much different, American Sign Language and British Sign Language, even though the words are the same. They sign differently. So I decided to leave that part out. Phonemes are a way of describing the smallest meaning units of spoken language, such that changing a phoneme will change the meaning of a word. The phonetic repertoire of any one language reflects the range of possible speech sounds that could be used to make up a word, and language vary considerably in their phonetic repertoires. Mandarin is the official spoken language in China and contains a wider range of fricative and affricatives than English. For example, while some sub-Saharan African languages, for example, Xhosa, use ingressive speech sounds where air is sucked into the mouth like a clip-clop sound as phonemes. And of course, the Dene language has some of these affricatives and fricatives that do not exist in the English language. And that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult for people that have only spoken English, like me, or somebody that has never spoken Dene, have a difficult time making those sounds. Within any particular language, any single phoneme can be quite an abstract concept. The leaf L is called a clear L, and the bell L is called a dark L. These two very different L sounds are described as allophones in the same phoneme, different sounding versions of the same phoneme, allophones. And speech sequences of phonemes are organized around syllables. These correspond roughly to the beats of speech, with each syllable forming one beat. It is the pattern of syllables that gives speech sequences their rhythms, and there is evidence that this is one of the ways that babies start to detect words and syllables in infancy. Although overall syllable structure can vary across languages, languages are always based around syllables, and syllables are always structured around a vowel. And of course, this is one of the ways, this is back in the old days when you had to type your own papers, and if a word was too long, instead of moving the whole word, you type part of it out and then you go, oh, rats, I've run out of room. You'd have to find a place to break it, and you always broke it at the end of a syllable. So that was one of the things that you needed one of the reasons that you needed to learn how to break down words by their phonemes. You needed to figure out the syllables. Now, of course, if you understand that a syllable equals a vowel sound, then you know that with each vowel sound in the word, you have that number of syllables. So snap has one because there's only one vowel sound. And basket has two because there's two vowel sounds, a and eh. Now, if you have two vowels together, well, two vowels together like EA or AI or OA, then that's still only one vowel sound. It's only one sound. Syllables are not formed by random patterns of consonants around vowels. There are rules within every spoken language about the ways that phonemes can be combined in syllables, both before and after the vowel. The phonotactic legality varies across languages, with different combinations of phonemes being possible in some languages but not in others. And this is one of the reasons why some people have a difficult time speaking English, and we have difficult time speaking French, and difficult time speaking German. Not so much Spanish, of course, doesn't have very many irregular sounds in it. So Spanish tends to be a little bit easier than other languages. And this is one of the reasons why languages are sometimes difficult to learn. Words are the psychological linguistic structures that relate directly onto our experience. We use languages as representations that map onto the the things and events that we want to describe. Words and syllables are arguably the basic units with which we engage with language. Once we have learned to read, we can decompose words into phonemes, but if we have not learned to read, this kind of detail is much harder to grasp, while we can still decompose speech into words and syllables. Words and syllables are also the level at which babies start to engage with the elements of spoken language. Now, this is really kind of interesting because when we were living in Nebraska, I got a language on tape. I think there were 5 tapes, 5 cassette tapes, and I was trying to learn French. Now, it was almost impossible for me to, well, it was impossible for me to learn French, and the reason is because it was all oral. It was me listening to them pronounce these words. In order for me to learn languages, I'm a visual learner, so I would need to see the word before I would get the word. So here, I'm listening to all this stuff. Le beefsteak, the beefsteak. But if I couldn't see it, then it was really hard for me to visualize or to understand what it was that I was learning. And so I didn't learn any French, despite the fact I listened to these tapes over and over and over and over again. I just couldn't visualize where are the vowel sounds. What does this word look like? It's because I'm a visual learner. Now the strange part is that I am so visual that if I learn somebody's name and I saw you, then I would see your name in my head when I'm pronouncing who you are. So if your name is Charlie, I would see Charlie in my head, and I'm seeing Charlie in my head as we speak. So I'm a visual learner. That may mean that I didn't really do a very good job of learning how to speak when I was a kid because I didn't know how to read. But it also means that when I started reading and looking at words, then I was a whole word method learner. And I learned to read a lot faster than most of my peers, most of my cohorts, the people in the first and second and third grade. I learned to read a lot faster than they did because I was a visual learner, as weird as that is. Now the problem is, and I'm starting to have problems reading this text, and the reason is because in the textbook they explained how you read and how you break down words, and because of that, they were talking about the phonetic method, and I'm a whole word reader, and because of that, my brain is going, well, you're supposed to break down each syllable, and that's what I'm doing. That's why I'm struggling getting through this lecture, as weird as that may seem. But now that I've said that, maybe I'll do better. I won't be struggling in the rest of the PowerPoint. Morphemes are synaptic structural units within a word and can be considered to refer to the smallest possible unit of meaning, which is not necessarily a word. The base or the stem of a morpheme assigns meaning to the word. For example, bee is the stem or base of bees. Bees is plural for bee. Bee is also a free or unbound morpheme. It can appear without elaboration as a standalone word. Prefixes are morphemes which come before a stem, such as pre and prefigure or ex and export. Suffixes are morphemes which come after the stem, like the S in bees or the ED in carpeted. These suffixes and prefixes are bound morphemes. They cannot appear on their own as individual words. Let me take a quick drink. Lemonade. A lemonade. Further distinctions can be made within the content words, for example, nouns versus verbs. While these break down somewhat into things versus actions, the boundary is blurred quite a lot in languages, like English, where many nouns can be used as verbs. There are, in fact, few nouns in English which cannot be used as a verb. There are differences in the processing of nouns and verbs. Verbs typically are longer to process than nouns because a verb involves associated information about not just the action, but the object which it is performing. The syntactic structure, determining the different parts in the sentence depending on their grammatical relationship to one another, is the kind of structure that has been discussed most thoroughly in cognitive psychology. There are other kinds of structure, like the thematic structure, which refers to the relationship between the meanings of the words in a sentence. And this is a cartoon, and it's a joke, but it's really kind of an interesting joke. Our school's having a spring dance, I heard. Would you like to volunteer? Do they need people to decorate? No, they're just going to decorate the gym. You can wear whatever you want. Okay, so what she said is, do they need people to decorate? And what she meant was, do they need people to help decorate? And the way she said it, might have been asking, do they need to decorate? Do they need people that they can decorate, put the decorations on? And that was the joke. And there she goes. She just got it. Okay. Anyway, so this has to do with syntax, and she's misinterpreting what this individual is saying. As funny as that is. No, they don't want to decorate people. The study of psycholinguistics is traditionally associated with the latter half of the 20th century, as epitomized by the work of Chomsky. This is Noam Chomsky. That's Noam Chomsky right there. Of course, when he, in 1950, so this is him, and he's actually still alive. He's like 95 years old, maybe 95 in that picture. Chomsky in 1957 noted that we are able, and he was in his 20s when he came up with this idea. Chomsky noted that we are able to generate and understand entirely novel sentences, and his insight came from a hypothesis that this capacity must result from an underlying application of linguistic rules. A further development of this hypothesis holds that the ability to use these rules must reflect an innate, prepotent ability which does not need to be learned. That's his English, and you can tell this is an English text because instead of saying learned, they say learnt. Chomsky considered that human language could not be acquired. This is English, or this is the Brits, so you don't do that. Don't say whilst, and don't say learnt because it's not American. It's English. It's Brit speak. Chomsky, and I missed it. Sorry about that. Usually I correct all these things. Chomsky considered that human language could be acquired by learning alone. Key to Chomsky's approach was the concept of an underlying deeper syntactic structure which underpins the surface expression of a sentence. Now, there's a reason why there's not so much Chomsky in this text, and the reason is because he's not a cognitive psychologist, so they didn't like him. Chomsky, 1957, this is a little before the cognitive psychologists. And this is a cognitive psychology text. So we're not going to really talk about too much more Chomsky, even though Chomsky makes a lot of sense. One of the things that Chomsky said is that we have this innate ability to learn languages, and it's called the language acquisition device. It's something that's in our brain. Children have it. Children learn language very, very rapidly. Usually by the second year, they're already speaking fairly articulately. But we lose it. We lose it about age 12 when we go through puberty. Chomsky's original hypothesis was that the rules governing language must be innate, as they are not learned. Children go through stages where they over-apply syntactic rules and make errors suggesting that the rules are real. This can be interpreted as showing that they have learned asyntactic rules and that they are over-applying it. And this has to do with Chomsky's idea of a language acquisition device. Here's this baby in a whatever that is. What's the big surprise? All the latest theories of linguistics say we're born with innate capacity for generating sentences. And here's this little kid speaking in sentences. Several factors are involved in the recognition of words, both written and heard, and there is also considerable interest in the ways that we can build cognitive models that capture the properties of how our mental lexicon, all the words that we know, is represented. In, in the Morton 1969 model, every word is represented by a unit called a logogen, and each logogen represents characteristics called features about that word. As the perceptual systems processes incoming words, logogens increase in activity as evidence accumulates for each one. Contextual evidence can also add to this activation, so if the incoming phonetic evidence for a word starting ta and the contextual evidence is for a piece of furniture, the logogen for table will increase the logogen for title, and for will increase, the for table will increase, and the logogen for title will decrease, although both will have been increased in activation by the word starting with a T sound, along with all the other T initial words. In other words, when we see a word like logogen, I'd never seen this word before until I'd never seen this word before until I read this textbook. The idea is that when we see a word that we don't know or a word that we have to interpret, we put it in a category, and that category starts with whatever the first letter is, T, or TA, the first syllable. That's the logogen. In other words, that guides us as to what this word is going to be. When the threshold for that particular logogen is reached, the logogen fires and the word is recognized. So if it's TA and we know that the context has to do with furniture, then it's probably table. The threshold for any one logogen is sensitive to context. Everything is sensitive to context. Yesterday, was it yesterday? Yeah, it was yesterday. No, it was the day before. Monday and Tuesday, I got a lot of calls from, they kept telling me that somebody was trying to use my credit card. It was a scam. It was a scam. They were trying to get me to let them on my my website. They wanted to know the passwords to my to my computer and my cell phone, so that potentially they could take some money out of my account. Except, I don't do that. My wife takes care of all that on her computer and on her telephone, so it's not on my telephone at all. Anyway, so these guys from, I don't know, they sounded like they were from India or Pakistan or someplace like that. It was kind of difficult to understand what they were saying because, they had a script and they were reading the script fairly well, but their accent was so strong, it was really difficult to understand what they were saying. So, I had to kind of shift gears in my brain in order to understand what was going on. And I recognized it as a scheme right away. And I'm kind of mean, and I let them along for a while. So don't worry, they didn't get into either any of my electronic information. They called me on my landline, as weird as that is. I still have a landline. That's weird. There are a great many of these regular past tense verbs, at least 10,000 past tense verbs, or verbs that we talk about. These regular inflections can be contrasted with irregular past tense verbs like eat becomes ate, have becomes had, run becomes ran. These are irregular verbs. If it was a regular verb, it would be eated, it would be haved, it would be runned instead of ran and had and ate. Those are irregular verbs. For these irregular verbs, the past tense verbs cannot be simply predicted from the present tense form, and they can be phonetically very dissimilar, like tell and told, and am and was. There are many fewer irregular verbs, around 106 in English, and they typically are very high in frequency. That is, they are very commonly used verbs. So the regular verbs, you just put an ed at the end. The irregular verbs, you change the word completely. In English, there is a tremendous dominance of regular verbs. 86% of the most frequent 1,000 verbs in English are regularly inflected. However, it is not clear that regularization, application of the regularity rule, is the default way of generating past tenses when no lexical irregular form is available. Bring, brought, buy, bought, fight, fought, think, thought, teach, taught, and catch, caught. These are irregular verbs. Speech production, they're not the only ones. What did we say, 106? Yeah. Speech production, deciding what we want to say and articulating this accurately and fluently, is a behavior which we take very much for granted and which we typically do extremely well. It has been estimated that any one talker uses a production vocabulary of around 20,000 words, but that we make mistakes of word selection in only around every 1 in a million words produced. And this is a joke, but the joke reflects this. He says, "Thanks for your introductory speech at the conference. By the way, Hibbelmeyer, it's hard-headed businessmen, not thick-headed businessmen." Which, yeah, okay. One, they have different meanings. Of course, hard-headed means they're tough, and thick-headed means they're stupid. Anyway, that's the joke. The processes involved in turning thoughts into spoken words are called lexicalization. The two main stages have been hypothesized. The first stage comprises a link between conceptual thoughts and word forms, which include semantic and syntactic information, but not phonological details. This is called the lemma, and the process of identifying and choosing the correct word is called lemma selection. In the second stage, the lemma makes contact with the phonetic representation of the word, called the lexeme, and the specifying of this form is called lexeme selection. See, now I'm having problems reading. And of course, I bought a dictionary, so I'll never be at a loss for words. And of course, I was just at a loss for words. Now, this is really kind of interesting because, like I said, this is an English textbook. And if this were an American textbook, I'm guessing that lexicalization would not be a word that you've seen. This is the first time I've ever seen that word. And lemma is another one, and lexeme. I've never seen these words before. I've taught linguistics. I never saw these words before. So this is something that only happens in England. Much of the evidence of this two-stage form of word selection and speech production comes from a frustrating state that many people have experienced called tip-of-the-tongue phenomenon. And they didn't call it tip-of-the-tongue phenomenon in your textbook. They called it tip-of-the-tongue selection. When in this condition, people have, but we call it in the United States, tip-of-the-tongue phenomenon. When in this condition, people have an absolute certainty that they know a word that they want to say, combined with a lack of sensation of how they should say it. It is this state people can often access a lot of information about a word, such as what it means and aspects of the syntax, and this has been ascribed to being able to access lemma information without being able to make contact with the lexeme detail. Okay, so now we know what we're talking about. Good example is cholecystokinin. I saw it as CCK, that's the abbreviation for cholecystokinin. I couldn't come up with the word. It took me about, 5 or 10 seconds to remember cholecystokinin, the word cholecystokinin. So that was tip of the tongue phenomenon as far as I was concerned. And of course, he's having the same problems, trying to get the word out. And he's moving his hand, hoping that will force it out. Didn't quite work. Garrett in 1975 developed a model of speech production based on a set of speech errors, which he considered to be particularly informative. Word substitutions, these affect content words, not typically function words, such as man for woman or day for night. and the substitutions often have some semantic or phonological association. That's word substitution. Word exchanges in which words from the same category normally swap positions with each other, such that nouns swap with nouns and verbs with verbs. Sound exchange errors such as classic spoonerisms like wasty term for tasty worm. Yeah, we're going to talk about tasty worms. Where the onset or words swap positions with each other, commonly over the words which are next to each other. Sound exchanges tend to be highly constrained. People don't make mistakes where vowels are swapped with consonants, and sound exchanges move across syllables, not within them. People do not say back when they mean cab. Morpheme exchanges, this is where word endings, morphological inflections, move to other points in the sentence, such as, have you seen Easter's Hector egg? For have you seen Hector's Easter egg? These are also known as stranding errors and typically also involve a word moving in the sentence. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to test you, I'm not going to quiz you over anything that is an English linguistic term that we don't have in American English, in American linguistics. I didn't realize American linguistics was so very different from English linguistics. Human language is not just an extraordinarily complex system for representing and processing information. It is also the dominant system within which we communicate with each other. Discourse is the term that refers to the higher order aspects of language use, both in terms of how connected ideas are expressed, for example, over the course of sentences, and in conversation, which is the shared use of language in interactions. Discourse. So it's me talking to you. That's a discourse. You talking back to me. Conversation is an extremely interesting and complex use of language for several different reasons. It is a context in which we acquire spoken language. All of us learn to speak or sign in interactions with others. Conversation also represents an extremely good example of well-coordinated behavior, a verbal behavior which relies on very high order use of intentions and thought, and our main social tool for interaction. That's conversation. When we have conversations with people, certain universal rules are followed. These have been summarized by Sachs as the speaker change occurs, one person speaks at a time, simultaneous speech is common but brief, transitions with no gap and no overlap are common, turn order is not fixed, nor is turn size, duration of a turn, or content, number of talkers can vary, talk can be continuous or discontinuous. And this is one of the reasons why, if you've listened to any political debates, it's really kind of interesting when you listen to political debates. One of the things that Donald Trump did in 2016, it seemed like Donald Trump, there was no way that he was going to get the Republican nomination. There were too many high-powered individuals running, politicians running on the Republican ticket. But he won, and one of the reasons he won was because he didn't use the same rules that everybody else did. Normally, when somebody else was speaking, somebody else would interrupt them, but Donald Trump did that, and people thought that was cool. That made him look tough because he was talking over other individuals, and he wouldn't let an individual get a thought in edgewise. He wouldn't let them do that. And for that reason, this bullying tactic that he used when he debated, this is one of the reasons why a lot of people liked him, and that's one of the reasons why he won the 2016 election. Even though he won the Electoral College, but he lost the popular vote by over 3 million votes, which is kind of interesting. But we won't go into that. We're talking about debating. And so his style of debating is to talk over everybody else, to be louder, to be meaner, to bully other individuals. So he didn't follow these rules of conversation. And one of the reasons why he may not have done that is because as a wealthy person all of his life, he has never had to follow these rules. That may be one of the reasons why, he does the things he does. Why he thinks he can get away with things that he does. Why he doesn't follow the rules. He doesn't have to. He's wealthy. Wealthy people have different rules than everybody else. Really kind of fascinating. We'll see what happens next, because right now he seems to be losing power. All of these things, there's a lot of lawsuits against him. So we'll see what happens. We'll see if this disqualifies him. I mean, the whole fact that potentially what may happen in the near future. I know that this is cognitive psychology and not politics, but it may be interesting to watch to see if he's able to get through all of these negative things. It looked like he led the insurrection, the attack on the Capitol, that it was his idea, that they'd been planning this. And if that is proven by the January 6th committee or by the DOJ, then it may disqualify him for the 2024 presidential election. And that should be interesting to see. So we'll just, this has to do with the rules. Most people don't try to speak over anybody else, but now he has people that are doing exactly what he does: speak over other individuals, not let them. They use terms that other people don't use. They attack other individuals. They use conspiracy theories rather than proven fact. Really kind of fascinating to watch what's happening right now, especially if you're a political scientist like I am, and a psychologist like I am, and you understand linguistics like I do to some extent. Not the English linguistics, but American linguistics. Speakers in a conversation are generally excellent at following these rules, and if you've ever had the unpleasant experience of talking to someone who won't let you take your turn, you'll be hopefully struck how infrequently this happens. And they're right. I mean, normally, if I want to continue a conversation with somebody, I won't speak over them, and I will let them have their turn. And of course, Trump doesn't have to worry about that because, he's always been wealthy. And other people didn't want to speak when he wanted to speak because he's got money and they're hoping to get money from him or something. I don't know. The principles likely exist because they form a natural framework in which relatively unconstrained conversation can be easily managed. It has been observed that maximum limit on conversational partners is around 4 to 5 people. If a social group gets larger than this, separate subgroups of conversational partners will emerge. The exact reason for this has yet to be determined, though it may be relatively simple for 2 to 4 people to negotiate the acceptable boundaries of conversation, for example, managing who speaks next, but much harder for 6 to 7 people. The management of turn-taking in conversation is very important. Even in phone conversations, complete strangers who cannot see each other manage to take turns in conversation very smoothly. The vast majority of intervals between turns in conversation fall within a range of plus or minus 150 milliseconds. This speed is far faster than one would expect to see if turns were entirely reactive. That is, the preparation for a turn were to start when the prior talker has finished their turn, which would be associated with far longer reaction times. Instead, it has been suggested that talkers in a conversation start to entertain their behavior with each other, speaking at the same rates as each other, and that talkers time their turns based on the speech rhythm and prosody of the other talkers during their turns. In other words, when we are talking to somebody, we try to match their means of speaking. This is one of the reasons why I have such a difficult time talking to somebody who speaks really, really fast, because as a farm boy from Indiana and somebody who's done and been the places that I've been, and having lived on Indian reservations for 17 years, the speech patterns is slower. And so when somebody speaks faster, This isn't natural for me, and I have a difficult time trying to keep up with what they're saying, for one thing, and also trying to speak as fast as they do. Otherwise, I don't get a turn. Conversation has been described as an incredibly detailed exercise in coordinating our verbal behavior with that of our other co-talkers. When we talk to the other people, we start to coordinate our breathing and speech rate with each other. We also start to coordinate the language that we use when we talk to each other. We will start to use the same words and the same grammatical constructions, as interesting as that is. One of the first people to explore pragmatic use of conversation was Greece in 1975, who established that when someone talks, it is important to decode their intentions in addition to their words. Greece described talkers as implying much of the information in their statements. Greece identified differences of implied meaning, which he termed implicatures, which are ways of describing the meaning implied in speech acts. And this joke fits what we're talking about. We're talking about implication. Who can tell me what the subject is? Now he's talking about this sentence, and he wants to know what the subject of the sentence is. The dog chased the cat. Well, the subject of the sentence is dog, but this individual didn't understand what the implicature was, what the implication should have been. He says it's grammar, isn't it? We're talking about grammar. That's the subject. Anyway, implications. Conventional implicatures, these arise from semantic representations of the meanings of particular turns of phrase which are used in conversational speech. Thus, someone may use the phrase "I have to say" at the start of a sentence and not be understood to mean that they are being forced to say anything. And of course, this guy says, this job is tough. This is a professional hide-and-seek team scouting department. This job is tough. Good players are almost impossible to find. Now that has a double meaning, of course. Since they're professional hide-and-seek people, they're hiding. Anyway. Conversational implicatures, these arise from the concept that there is implied meaning in how sentences are constructed in speech. If a talker says, "I would take fish pie to the party, but I think Jane is allergic," the use of "but" is drawing a contrast between the two statements. This kind of meaning is operating at a pragmatic level. The idea of an American taking a fish pie to a party, that's a Brit thing. Unfortunately, my weight is like the stock market. In the short run, it goes up and down, but over the long term, it keeps reaching new heights. Cooperative principle. This is a joke. This is a funny joke. Cooperative principle. This principle entails that talkers make your conversational contribution, such as is required at the stage of the conversation at which it occurs, by the accepted purpose of direction of the talk exchange in which you find yourself. The principle leads to 4 maxims. The maxim of quantity, say what is informative for the discussion, but no more and no less. The maxim of quality, don't say what is untrue or what you consider to be untrue. The maxim of relation, which means, in short, that what you say should be relevant or germane to what is being discussed. The maxim of manner, try not to be ambiguous or hard to understand. And this is according to Greece. This is known as the cooperative principle. So speak as much as you need to. It needs to be truthful. It needs to be related to what you're talking about, and you need to be not be difficult to understand. And here's the joke. I know it's a bummer. We don't like it any more than you do. Now back away from the desk. And the reason he needs to back away from the desk is because the back of his gown, hospital gowns are notorious. The back of them is open, and they don't want to see his naked butt. Anyway, that's the joke. I think that's just hilarious. And that is the end of the chapter. So there you go. Language. Like I said, I've studied linguistics. I was an English major. My bachelor's degree is in English. So I studied English. uh, as an undergraduate, and I'm taking linguistics classes. I think it's really fascinating, but this British linguistics is a little bit different. Anyway, okay, that's linguistics. And next week we'll talk about language disorders.